If it'll happen to me. I think we might be a little loud, Larry. How about now? Testing? Better? Okay. Maybe down just a little bit. Yeah, it's a little bit more. Yeah, I'm here it rattling. The one night my voice is actually working. That was off. So, how about now? There we go. I think that's good. Maybe I'm just not meant to do this. I don't know. So last week we talked about Hasmoneans, which was something that most of us had never even really heard of before, and we talked about the Herodians, the people that followed Herod and how they followed. So before I jump into this again tonight, what I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we go through all these different groups, because each one of these groups is, like I said, we talked about the Pharisees, we talked about the Sadducees, we've talked about the Herodians last week. Remember who they were at the beginning. Every one of these groups, before the Maccabean revolt and before the Romans and the Greeks invaded the Holy Land, these were all Jewish people that all believed and worked through the same problems the same way. There was not a lot of division in the in the Hebrew church up until this point. And so, what we're doing in this, or what I'm hoping to show in this study that we're doing, is this fragmentation that occurred and when it occurred and what happens from that fragmentation that ends up causing, honestly, it caused all of the Jews, with the exception of a few. I see the light. It caused all of the Jews, for the most part, with the exception of a few, and we're going to get into one group that didn't miss it at all. But there were certain people from each group that followed Christ, but the vast majority of people, because of these divisions, missed Christ coming to save the Jews. I mean, that's what he really came for initially. He was here to save the Jewish people, to get them not away from the law, but to get them to understand that the law was not the important thing that they were following. They were supposed to be following God, and they had lost their way in following God. And like, I think the biggest takeaway to that is, look at where we are today in our society. And that's the whole point of all this. When I started doing this for the men's group weeks and weeks and weeks ago, it was because I thought I saw, and I believe I saw the same things that they were doing back then. We're repeating it now. And I don't think we're that far from second coming of Christ. And I mentioned this yesterday in the men's Bible study, and this is totally off what we're doing tonight, but if you look at what has God allowed to have happen in history, how many times did the Jews have to fall away, and he kept allowing them to come back, and they'd fall away, and it's like they had a memory about this long. 40 days Noah's in the mountain, and they forget about God all of a sudden, and they're doing something different. So as humans, we have a short memory, and the Jews, the whole history of the Jews shows that. But the problem is, everything they did, we're doing today. We have how many denominations of a Christian church that we can't agree on anything? We can't figure out how to work together. We're so divided that our divisions is more important than following God. And that's what I truly believe. And that's what happened to the Jews. And that's why I'm showing you this particular history. Because if you don't understand this history, the Old Testament is a great foundation. And I think it was Larry or one of the gentlemen yesterday, it might have been Paul, said that there's a lot of churches now not even teaching Old Testament. Old Testament that is our foundation for the New Testament. Christ came to fulfill the law, not erase the law, not to replace the law. So that's why we're doing this. And so the takeaway of this is, everything we're learning here, try to apply what we're doing, what you're seeing from this historical point of view, to what's going on in the world today. And if you do that, I think you're going to find a different foundation to look at this from. This is the maps we talked about last week that I didn't have the ability to show you. So we talked about the different kingdoms, and if you look here, you see Judea, and right below it you see Idumea, and that's where some of these kings from that the Romans eventually appointed came from that southern area. If you look, there's a place called Decapolis up there on the upper right. Now, what Decapolis means is Deca in Greek is 10. That's the 10 Greek cities that continued to stay Greek even when Christ was on earth. And then you have Samaria, Judea, and Galilee at the top. Now, the reason I want you to keep in mind of all that, Christ spent most of his time in his ministry up around Galilee, but he went to all these areas. But he spent the vast majority of his time in the ministry was spent up around that Galilee area. Samaria, if you look, is kind of where that's where Mount Nebo and where Jacob's well is, and we're going to get into the Samaritans probably tonight. And Judea, originally before this map, Judea it's one country divided into two. And it was originally divided, Judea at the bottom, and where you look where Jerusalem is, from there, if you can see the little black star there, from there up it was Israel. So originally there was two. When it first divided, remember it's one country, Israel. And then all of a sudden now it's two countries. It goes to Israel, then and Judea at the south. And now it's broken up into multiple. Okay, then each tribe ends up having lands, but instead of being 10 tribes that are all united, they become 10 tribes that become these denominations in a sense. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. I'm going to buzz through these real fast. This is where Herodians we went through last night, but I wanted you to look at that map, and I probably should have hid these, but there's not a lot of these, so I'll get through these real quick. But okay, so here's the map though where Herod's sons. Remember Herod, when he died, he had the three sons, the four sons. And so the blue area is one, the purple area is one, the red area is one, and the pink area down here in the bottom is one. And so the blue area, remember the one son they're all from Herod, but so they had a Jewish background, even though they were more Greek in their thinking. So that whole blue area there is what the Romans end up when they say that this one son is not doing a good job at running the land. They take him out and put Pontius Pilate here. So now Pontius Pilate is running this whole blue area. And so that's kind of the reference point for this. And Decapolis, again, is still very Greek. It's now run by the Romans, but it's a very Greek city in nature. And the Greeks and Romans were so closely related ideologically and religiously that they didn't really argue too much against each other once Rome came in. Again, I'm just going to, okay, so the scribes. So this is where we stopped last time. We talked about Ezra being a scribe, and we got into the scribes, who the scribes were, and how important it was for the scribes to make sure that the documents that they wrote, the scrolls that they wrote, had any errors in them. So that proves the veracity and the authenticity of the Bible. I mean, and we can go back now in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we're going to get into later on if we keep doing this on Wednesday nights. I'll show you where we've got scrolls now that are almost 1,000 years older than Christ being on earth that are exactly the same as what we read today and what they had before that. So, and before that, the oldest scrolls that we had were probably about 800 AD. Now we've got some that are over 800 to 1,000 BC. We talked to, remember the scribes are the ones that they started out, they're the ones that are copying the Bible, they're the ones that are copying the Old Testament, they're sending out all of the scrolls to the different tabernacles and temples as the towns grow. Every time a town goes in, they put in a tabernacle, somebody has to scribe those and send them. But eventually the scribes become priests, like we talked about last week. For those of you who weren't here last week, I apologize. I'm going through this kind of quickly. So the scribes, and the reason the scribes are in this as a sect, they're not a sect as far as where like the Pharisees and the Sadducees are religious division of the sects. Then we're going to get into a couple other ones that are more politically. The Herodians were a political division of the Jews. The scribes they had a job. Ezra was probably the most illustrious. He was probably the most well-known scribes, probably one of the first scribes that started writing all the Bible down. And as these scribes keep going, they're the ones who can read and write. Most people in this society can't read and write. so they become priests. They end up taking it. Remember, all the priests are Levites, right? Supposed to be Levites. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees all come from the line of Levi, even though they have a division about 147 BC, and that's where for them that's where their beliefs change. The Sadducees go more Greek thinking. Pharisees are more Jewish thinking. The Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. They don't believe in an afterlife. All the things that even Christians today believe. They didn't believe any of that. They also disappeared not long after Christ was on earth. They didn't last long after the resurrection. Neither the Pharisees nor the scribes, in any great extent. And again, I'm just make sure I hit all the high points for you. So this was just about how accurate they had to be before they could now. So basically, the scribes now, remember, Jesus has gone, when he goes into Jerusalem, and Matthew 23 is the whole chapter, is Jesus rebuking the Pharisees and the scribes. That's who he mentions. He doesn't mention the Sadducees in that. He says, so the scribes are important enough in this sense that Jesus actually mentions them several times in the Bible. So that's what I want you to get from this, is they're not just a group of people that they're writing stuff down and they're sending it out. They're now in enough power that Jesus calls them out. He's rebuking them just as much as he rebukes the Pharisees. But he's also rebuking the Sadducees, not without even saying who they are. So the next group we're going to talk about is the Zealots. And we don't know much about the Zealots from the Bible. What they're called Sicarii, or they were called dagger men. And the reason they were called dagger men, and again, this is another group of Jews, they carried out assassinations. But who were they assassinating? Why are they assassinating anyone? They not only rejected Rome's rule over the Holy Land, but they were willing to resort to any violent means they could to get Rome out of the Holy Land. They wanted Rome gone. They wanted the Jews to have the Holy Land. This was like the Maccabean revolt. They're hoping to bring in another Maccabean revolt. And Rome has already had the Maccabean revolt once. They're not about to let it happen again. So this group is hunted heavily by Roman guards, by Roman soldiers. If they find a zealot, they go right to a cross. They're crucified. They're put to death instantly. In today's world, we would call them terrorists, but to them, they were patriots. And there's an old saying: one man's patriots, another man's terrorists. So that's the thought. They felt like they were doing God's work, or they were doing God's will, and we don't know whether they were or not, other than the sense that Rome did not like them at all. But they were a different sect. The reason that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes were against these guys was because they were causing dissension in the Holy Land. What happens whenever something happens in the Holy Land and Rome gets upset by it? They go and oppress all of the Jewish people. But who's in power? It's the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees. So who gets their teeth pulled whenever Rome comes in? It's the Pharisees, the scribes. So these guys were not only hated by Rome, but they started being hated by their own people. At least the people in power. The reason they got their name is there's the sword that they carried. It was a little small sword called a sakai. And it was a little dagger. There's a sword that's a little longer, and then they have the dagger. And sica in Latin actually means to cut. And that's where the name comes from. It's a Latin name. And so Sicarius in Latin means stealthy assassin. So this Sicarii they're stealthy assassins that carry a dagger. That's how the whole name came about. And that's a picture of one of the daggers. Which is also interesting that it's the same. It looks the same as an oil lamp. If you look at the sheath that it's carried in, it looks like an oil lamp. Now, I'm surmising this. The reason it would look like an oil lamp is if you're carrying a dagger and you don't want anybody to know it, what would be easy to... Everybody carried oil lamps. So you make it look like something else. And so this is how they can hide this dagger to do what they want to do. And again, I can't find anything historical in that, but I make knives and I've made sheaths, and I would never make a sheath like that to fit a knife like that. But it makes sense because of the fact that it looks like one of their oil lamps. So these guys were instigators. They tried several times to get a revolution. They were unsuccessful in getting a revolution. But in Galilee after Christ in 66 AD, they actually were able to get the Jewish war going, or they were a big part of getting that going, that caused the fall of the temple in 70 AD. But this is way after Christ has already risen and gone back to heaven. So although Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, the last bastion of the Zealots, have y'all ever heard of Masada? Masada is where that's the Zealots. The Zealots held out there until 73 AD. They had nearly 1,000 people, including women and children, and they preferred mass suicide as opposed to being captured by the Romans. They knew what was going to happen. You remember what happened at one other point in history, back a few weeks ago, one of the Herodians, after the Maccabean revolt, the Hasmonean kings took 800 Jews and put them on a cross, and then later on they did 2,000 Jews and put them on a cross. But not only did they put them on a cross, while those men were dying on the cross, they killed their wives and children in front of them. And so these people were willing to die by suicide as opposed to go through that. And that's why Masada was a suicide pact, because they didn't want to see. They would rather do it themselves and do it quickly than everybody being slaughtered the way Romans. Because anybody that's selling my stuff on crucifixion, you know how bad crucifixion was. So these at this time in this war, over 1 million Jews starved and were killed in battle, crucified, or enslaved. And these slaves were the ones that ended up building the Roman Colosseum in Rome. These are the Christians that get into the Colosseum, and they're thrown to the lions for entertainment for the Romans later on. This is this group. That's not the Zealots, but because of the war that the Zealots helped instigate, all those Jews who are now enslaved, they end up in Rome as entertainment for the Roman emperors and the citizens. So we know of at least one zealot in the Bible, and that's Simon the Zealot. And he is the one that Christ calls to follow him as a disciple. And if you've watched The Chosen, it's a pretty interesting thing when Jesus throws his dagger into the river. I don't know if that really happened, but you got to think what the importance that these people put on the tools that they had at the time. That's like, Jesus is turning somebody who's violent, willing to be extremely violent, just like Paul. When he turned Paul or Saul into Paul, these are violent people that they're able to turn into good Christians who teach other people how to be Christian. So God can use anybody at any time, and that's his will. We just have to allow him to come to us and us follow what he wants us to do. I don't know your path. I don't even know my path most days. But these guys had a path that was given to them that directly by God. I won't read the verse, but basically this is Mark 3:18, where Jesus finds Simon, and with the other disciples, he calls him. It's important. I don't know if y'all remember when I said the words "follow me." I think it was last week we said that. The power of the words "follow me" from a rabbi to a student was incredibly powerful. So something about "follow me" there allowed Simon to change his whole heart and follow Jesus. And I think probably Jesus said to every one of those disciples, "Follow me" in some way. One of the things here I want you to also look at, in the very last line of that, you see Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot. There's an interesting name there that we don't think about, because Matthew is also son of Alphaeus. Now, Alphaeus, we know that Joshua is a common name, James is a common name, John is a common name, David is a common name. But Alphaeus is not an overly common name even at this time. So the question is it possible that James, now this is not James, this is the other James, and Matthew are actually brothers, because they're both son of Alphaeus. Now we don't know that for sure, because like I said, but his name would have been James Bar Alphaeus, Matthew Bar Alphaeus. So just an interesting thing to ponder. So in the presence of Jesus, he obviously changed his tactics. Judas Iscariot also was probably, if not a zealot, he probably followed zealot beliefs. So the zealots had a lot of influence on a lot of different people. And the reason they did was because what were the Jewish people looking for at this time from their Messiah? The Messiah they wanted, the Messiah they thought they were going to get was the warrior Messiah. So the zealots kind of fit that path for them. And so there's a lot of reason to think that the Iscarians is an area. Iscariot is not a last name. It's an actual area of the Holy Land. And there were a lot of zealots in that area. So it's possible, we don't know, it doesn't really tell us, but it kind of makes sense if you think about it. Why would Jesus pick someone like Judas who is going to betray him? Obviously, it's the plan. God has a plan, and he's going to enact that plan. But to have somebody who will, Simon's a zealot, and he doesn't take that path. I mean, he finds out that Christ is here for peace, not for war, and he doesn't take the path that Judas does. So Judas is my thought, and this is my thought, and I think there's some theological basis behind some of that Judas was probably looking so much for the warrior Messiah, he was willing to follow Christ because that's who he thought he was following at the beginning. But by the time he really finds out that he's the Prince of Peace, that he's willing to turn him over to the Romans because he's trying to start the war. He's trying to push Christ to make that. Yes, sir.
I really think physically what you're saying is exactly true, but he won a tremendous war spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
He came as a spiritual warrior, not a physical warrior.
Right.
And because if he didn't get that victory, nothing else matters.
Well, and we talked about this yesterday in the men's Bible study because I'm doing a whole different thing in the men's Bible study right now than this. But if you look and go back to what John's talking about, the war began at the fall of Adam and Eve, right? I mean, that's where the war starts. We don't know what happened up until Satan and Eve conspire to get the apple, and Adam takes a bite of the apple when the fall of man occurs. What we do know is, and I think this is proven by a lot of history, this is proven by some of the stuff that the Bible says, why did Satan feel the need to do that? He's trying to corrupt the bloodline. He knows somewhere in God's plan, Satan or these fallen angels know that they're going to be destroyed by the Messiah coming, and so they're trying to corrupt the whole bloodline. They don't want any pure bloodline. So that's where the Nephilim come from. That's what you can read Genesis chapter 6 and figure all that out. But by corrupting that bloodline, if you can corrupt every human being in a bloodline, you can't have Christ being born at least the way. Now, I argue this point. If God can create your blood, he can clean your blood. So Satan was never going to win that battle because Satan can't create. All he can do is modify or copy in a battle in a not good way. So, but what happens whenever Christ dies on that cross? What did he do when he went to hell? He gets the keys to hell, and I think he goes in there and he says, "I got the keys, and you're not getting out." Now, who's he talking to? Satan's not in hell yet. Satan's roaming the earth. And the fallen angels and Satan are still in air. There's 200 angels, if you read the book of Enoch, that when they did Genesis 6 and they corrupted the bloodline where the angels came in and they mixed with women, that was an abomination to God. They were not creatures of heaven because the angels are creatures of heaven. The women were creatures of earth. So these offspring are not creatures that God sanctioned to be created, so they're an abomination. So this is where our demons come from after the flood, and that's a different story. But when you start studying it, you go, okay, really, when he goes in there in hell and he says, "I got the keys, you're not getting out," he's talking to those 200 angels that defied God so badly that they did something that was an abomination to God. So he's already lost that battle, right? Christ's already on the cross. He's already died. He's already resurrected, and he's come back to earth for 40 days, and he showed people that he's back alive again. So Satan has to have plan 2. The second plan is he lost the first battle, and he knows he can't win the war. but his goal is to take as many of us with him to hell as he can. That's the battle that we fight today. So there's two battles. He lost the first one when Christ died on the cross. The second battle still continuing today. But he can only have those two plans. There's no other plans he could have. There's the only two possible plans that he could have ever had. Because he was never going to defeat God. God created him. Anyway, so.
I have so many whys that I've looked upon.
No.
There's just so many why like, we didn't do that. That wasn't our doing. I mean, it came down a long line from it. It just, I don't know. Sometimes I just get confused.
Well, and that's why the beauty of it is that there's a spiritual war and a supernatural. We talked about this at length yesterday in the men's Bible study.
But
There is
so
a
many,
there's a there's a
God can do anything. He can do anything, make anything possible. Like,
but he doesn't.
I won't know the answer.
What God doesn't want is robots. So he doesn't want to. He wants us to follow him willingly, and so he only gives us one task, and that is to choose to follow and believe that Christ died on the cross and is raised from the dead. If we believe that, and you truly believe that, and you start living your life according to that, Satan has no way to touch you ever again, because the power of Jesus' name erases any power he has on earth.
As long as you got faith.
As long as you're saved.
There's so much like turmoil
Yeah.
in the Bible now. It just, and right now I'm reading the Old Testament. I'm starting over all over again. And I'm going through the Old Testament, and it's just, some things I read and I get a little upset. I'm like,
Yeah, and that's kind of.
it seems so mean and angry and so like
Right on the news, you see the same thing.
Yeah. And that's exactly my point of this study verse. If you look at what happened back then and what the Jews were doing all the way from the time of the Exodus until basically Christ goes to the cross, the Jews follow the same pattern that we're following now. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't know whether the second coming's soon. I mean, to God, anytime soon, because God's everywhere and every when. But whether or not, I think what happens is, if you look, and again, we talked about this yesterday, how much technology did they have to build the pyramids? How much technology was in the world of, and these people they weren't geniuses, they weren't smart, but they had things. And what did God do? He allowed society to tear itself down to the point where it became the Middle Ages, it became Dark Ages, where everything went back to almost a starting from nothing. And if you look at 800 AD to about 1500 AD, the world was not a world that any of us would want to live in. It was really, truly Dark Ages. I mean, it was worse than any time probably in history. But it's because that's what God allows us to fall as far as we want to fall. But it's like the Tower of Babel. He's going to put things in. He's going to be patient. God's a long-suffering God, and he's patient. But there's a point where he goes, you know what, I've had enough. And I'm shutting everything down right here. That doesn't mean that's a second coming. But he can throw us back into the Dark Ages tomorrow with an EMP from the sun, with the stuff that's going on in the world tomorrow. But what's our job, and Christ said it a number of times, we are not to be afraid. God has his plan. His plan is being enacted all through. And all we have to do is, if we are followers and we believe, we watch for the signs. And as long as we watch for the signs, we won't know the day and hour of coming, but we can know when it's wrong, if it's biblically inaccurate. If it's biblically inaccurate, if things that are going on in the world, as long as we don't follow that path, we're still fine. God's got it. The problem we have to watch for is we don't take the bait and follow the wrong path. Because once you follow the wrong path a little ways, it's hard to get back to the right one. And that's the problem right now. They're making the path look like, for years it's been a gold path. Money was important. Society has devolved in a way that it's unbelievable how far society's devolved. We were talking about Chat GPT yesterday in men's Bible study. I brought that up. AI, we're about 18 months away from AI having general cognizant ability to think for itself. When it does that, you will be able to watch a video and know that it's true, because it can mimic your voice, it can mimic anybody's face, facial recognition software, voice recognition software. everything that's recorded, but your phone has voice recognition. Everything that can be recorded and has been recorded, AI is going to be able to take that and make it anything it wants to be. You can get on ChatGPT right now. I've already done it, and it's free. And you can ask it questions. And depending on how you ask the question is the answer you get. And PETA just decided to rewrite the whole book of Genesis.
What?
PETA, yes. PETA just decided to rewrite the whole book of Genesis in a way that's friendly to their cause for animals. Now, here's the problem with that. If that starts being taught in schools, that's what our kids are going to understand Genesis to be.
They're going to be following. In that video I told you to watch, that's what they say. They
Mhm.
said that the Rome,
That's
the Roman Church or the Pope, they all were rewriting the Bible to be a false narrative. They got tired of killing everybody, so they rewrote the Bible.
and you have and that's inaccurate, but there is some truth in points of that. And I can show you when we get a little further into this study that the Pharisees were so afraid that people would follow Christ. It's 7:00, but I want to go through that. I'll go through this real quick.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. The Pharisees that were in charge after Christ was put on the cross. If you go back and you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek writing of the Hebrew Old Testament, okay, that's the conversion to Greek, the Septuagint, that's the older one. They went back and they created another one called the Masoretic text. 90% of our Bibles today are created from the Masoretic text, and they're very accurate translations with the exception of a few things. There's about 30 to 40 things in the Masoretic that if you read it, the Pharisees were so afraid that people were going to start following Christ that they changed anything that looked, because if you go back and look at the Old Testament, I'm jumping way ahead of myself here, but everything in the Old Testament points to Christ. It points to Christ exactly the way he shows up through everything he did all the way to the cross. The problem is, in Isaiah 53, which I have on here, I think we would probably get to next week, but they don't even teach Isaiah 53 at all in any Jewish synagogue, even today. From the half of Isaiah 52 and all of Isaiah 53, they're called forbidden chapters. If you believe in any of that stuff, and I'll show you what that is later on, the Jewish people were told by their rabbis, you will not have an afterlife, period. If you believe, and what it's all about is there was about 30 to 40 points in the Old Testament that the prophets wrote about that pointed to Christ being who he was at the time he showed up, how he showed up, not being a warrior, but being the sacrifice. And there was one group that stayed true to that. But when the Pharisees saw that there were a lot of Jews that were starting to convert over to being, and even the Gentiles are now starting to convert over to Christianity, and this is after Christ is now gone from the earth, physically, not spiritually, they rewrote the text so that those 30 or 40 verses that are in the Old Testament don't say, now it points to Israel as a nation and not the person of the Messiah, but the nation of Israel. And so when you go back and you start comparing these two, and I've done it, you can find out by reading the Septuagint that how they did exactly what you're talking about. Any group can rewrite it and change anything they want to change. We have to figure out how to know we have a true version of what we're reading. And that's where this ChatGPT and these AIs and all this stuff is going to be scary, because our kids do everything now online. They can take any digital book right now and convert it to anything they want it to say. I mean, you can take Moby Dick, and if you get a digital version of it, you better have the regular version because somebody may have changed something there. Yes, sir.
And the bad thing of it is, the original software going into those robots comes from left-sided
Right.
people.
Yes, exactly.
Not thinking like a Christian at all.
No, and everything is coming out of, most of this stuff is coming out of Northern California, Silicon Valley, with and I'm not going to pick a political party. All the political parties are guilty of this. They're all into the same. We don't have two parties anymore. We have a uniparty.
Scare tactic. Satan always does something for make us fear.
Yep,
Because fear cancels faith.
yep. And what God and Jesus,
Ignore the fear. The more you see your fear, focus more on your faith, and it just disappears.
Jesus says it a number of times, and we have in this study as we go through this, I'm going to show you, it's already on here. Jesus says a number of times in the Bible, we are not to fear. We are only to follow. follow, don't fear. If you have faith and you follow that faith and you believe that Christ died on the cross for you, if you believe, and that's the problem is we here do. How do we get the people that don't? That's what, the other part of what I'm trying to do here is,
I think everybody has like questions, like I believe, and I know it's true. I know all that's true. I just have,
and that's faith,
and
because you haven't seen
A
it.
lot of people live off of, they go by emotions instead of their faith, and that's, we all do that. But I think a lot of them, they get stuck. Like a lot of people that are my age, they get stuck with all the whys and the oh, they're not comfortable with how that happened, so they don't like it. They don't.
Here's a great question for them. Do you believe in aliens? Because majority of people right now believe in aliens. So if you're willing to believe in it, how much faith do you have to have in an alien, believing in an alien, when there's no historical proof, there's no documented proof, but you don't have you're not willing to even look that angels might be real. So, and again, we're not going to change anybody's mind, but we can try to plant that seed that will eventually allow God to change their mind. That's all we can do. We have to stay focused on our faith. We have to stay diligent to our faith. We have to know what's true, and we have to dig into that Bible, and you got to read it. And that's what I've been trying to do at the men's groups. I showed them yesterday, and I'll challenge y'all tonight. Go home and find the demon goat in the Bible. Have y'all ever heard of the demon goat? It's in the Bible. It's called the demon goat. It's called the demon goat. I'll give you hints in Leviticus. Go dig it out. But and that, okay, so there's my perfect point. We read the Bible, and I've said this, I think I've said this in everything I've taught so far or tried to teach. We read it in the context of what we know and what we think. Here's the problem. The earth is something that it's tangible for us. You guys affect me, I affect you, we interact. There's a supernatural side of the Bible that they had a heavy belief in back in the first century and beyond. But we've now, as a society, we've decided to and Satan's done it on purpose. Because as soon as we stop thinking that there's a supernatural side of the Bible, he can't really exist, can he? I mean, think about it. So the minute you're not willing to consider all of the supernatural possibilities of the Bible, Satan kind of wins. Because he can't really exist if there's not a supernatural side of the Bible. Am I wrong, John?
No, faith, that's where faith comes in.
That's your faith. And so that's the thing is, if you're well armed enough to talk to somebody when they ask you a question, and the only way you can do that is understand that Bible and read it deeper than you've ever read it. And that's why I'm showing the guys all the time stuff that they haven't read. I didn't read it that way and probably read it 20 times and never solved something. Because if it's complicated, and there's a guy named Michael Heiser, I showed the book yesterday. He died a couple months ago. He was a PhD, he was a scholar. He wrote a number of books. He was a very Christian guy. And his books made me start thinking about a deeper way to look at this supernatural side of the Bible. But he says something amazing. If it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's important. But if you go to any church, and you start talking about anything in the Bible that's weird, they shut you off. They shut you down.
I don't care how much word you know, without the power of the Holy Spirit, it's still worthless.
Right.
You've got to have the power of the Holy Spirit, but you need the words.
To have that.
That's all the Holy Spirit will use.
Yep. And I think, and again, I don't know.
That's why Satan has went out of the way to demonize the Holy Spirit.
Oh.
So we won't use it.
Right, because and what did they say for years? The Holy Ghost. So now people believe in ghosts. It's never been Holy Ghost. It's Holy Spirit. And there are no such thing as a ghost. When your parents die or somebody dies, you do not see them again until you go to heaven. They don't show up over here. If they show up over here, if I saw my dad tomorrow walking down the street, I'm not thinking that's a good thing for me. That's a satanic intervention. They're trying to show you, and people are willing to fall for those kind of things because they want to believe it so badly. But if you really believe the Bible, there's nothing in the Bible that talks about somebody dying. It says absent from the body, present with the Lord. It doesn't say you get to bounce around here on earth a little bit more. It doesn't say that. So But again, this is all about trying to get armed with things and reading it at a level that you've never read it before. And so when I have a lot of stuff that I'm going to go through over the next few weeks. I can show you things that when you looked at it, and again, I've done it. I'm guilty of it a lot. I read over something, the genealogies, when we talk about, we talked about all those genealogies at the very beginning, and I said, I showed you what they actually meant. How many times did you really sit and read those? Because they're cumbersome, they're hard to read, they don't make any sense. So we glance over it. And so if it doesn't really have any application to our life today, we kind of forget about it. So anyway.
That's one thing about when you get a Jew person that comes to Christ and gets his eyes open, he's a fanatic because he knows all of this that we don't even understand.
Right.
And the same way with a Muslim. When they come to Christ, they're fanatics. They say, you people have no idea what darkness is all about.
And let me tell you, some of the most fanatical Christians that you'll meet is a Messianic Jew that comes out of the Jewish faith and becomes a Christian believer. You talk about, because they not only do they know now that Christ is their God, they know the Hebrew, and so they're well armed.
They're called zealots or terrorists.
Yes. Yeah. So, well, it's almost a quarter after. So, any questions, thoughts, ideas? I mean, I'm sorry to get off on that a little bit, but
Bobby's got one. I just want to know, you said devil?
goat demon,
Demon goat.
demon goat.
Okay, so you're not talking about
No.
goat that they put the sins on?
Yes, it's the scapegoat. It goes to the scapegoat. It goes to the scapegoat.
I'm looking at that and I said, I don't see
And the reason for that, the reason for that is that the Jews wandered around the wilderness. The wilderness was considered to be an unclean area. God kept them in the wilderness for a long time. And so when they kill it, they were to bring 2 goats and a bull. And so they kill the one goat. The bull was for Aaron and for the priest to cleanse themselves. So for them to have enough purity to go into the Holy of Holies to actually do, and this goes to Day of Atonement. Day of Atonement's when everybody's forgiven for their year's worth of sins. So the priest is cleaned by the blood of the goat. Then they have the goat that is killed and offered to God. That blood is offered to God. Then they have the other goat that is not killed. It's sent back out into the wilderness. Most of the time they took that goat out and they herded it till it fell off a cliff because they wanted it to die. They didn't want it to just roam around because it's a representation. I can't remember. It was an actual, there's a god, it starts with A. And there's so many of them that I've studied, I can't remember. But it's a specific god of that time, not God, big G God. I'm talking about the little g gods, which is probably a fallen angel that they were following. But this and this goat is to remind them, because there were a lot of people, if you read that in Leviticus, that whole phrase there were people going out, and it says, bring it to the door of the temple, to the curtain of the temple, to have it sacrificed. There were a lot of people going out and doing these pagan type sacrifices the same way, but had nothing to do with the priest, didn't have anything to do with the temple. So that was a pagan way to do it, and it was basically an offering to a whole different god, or not God in a sense that they had power, but God in the sense that, like Baal and one of those that Elohim is how it's pronounced in the Bible, and it says God, but it's little g God. It's not Yahweh. That's why Yahweh is always said Yahweh, because that was the way to distinguish him from all the other little g gods.
Thank God our high priest took care of all that.
Yeah. And so we have one high priest that we don't need to do all that stuff anymore. But that's what the whole demon goat thing is about. They were doing this in a very pagan way, and it's called the demon goat. So anyway, sorry. Any other questions? Sorry, I didn't mean to get, like I said, I went down a rabbit trail but I like rabbit trails too. And I've said that before in this. We do that in the men's group. I mean, sometimes the men's group, we get maybe 3 or 4 slides in, and then we start talking, and it'll take, we get off on rabbit trails, but I would rather us talk like that here, because I'm not trying to do what John does, Pastor John. I'm not a preacher. I'm just trying to, I would rather all of us learn from each other, because I'm still.
So if we talk about it and stuff, it's really interesting.
I'm fascinated by it, and that's always been my concern, is I don't know how many other people are as interested in it as I am. But the thing I'm interested in it more than anything else, if you start reading the Bible at a level that you've never read it before, and you start understanding it more, find a good lexicon, find a good book find a good some good. The commentaries are okay, but you got to watch the commentaries too. But there are a number of good Hebrew translators out there, and if you can translate the word from Hebrew back to Hebrew, and figure out what it actually means, you almost don't need any more. It's like God will open your eyes real quick if you can understand that. Yeah, it does take a while. Strong.
If you know the original language, it's a big help.
Oh yeah, and that's what I said. That's why the Jewish, when these Messianic Jews come out of Judaism and become Christians, they are phenomenally intelligent because of the fact they know the Hebrew inside and out. And that's one of the reasons there's been more Messianic Jew converts over the last 30 years than there ever has been in history. And that's why what it says in Daniel, knowledge is going to increase at the end of the age. I really truly believe that's what we're seeing right now. And we're seeing a lot of Jewish rabbis, not just Jews, Jewish rabbis that are converting over to the Christian faith, and they're giving us totally different interpretations of how the Jews see it and what it truly means in the Jewish culture. So anyway, Jonathan Cahn's a great one if you want to read anything about Jonathan Cahn. He's a
Oh, goodness. You really opened a can of worms. Have you seen his latest book?
the one about the gods.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have you read it yet?
parts of it.
I want to read it.
It
I mean, I've heard him talking about it.
Yeah.
I've listened to him, and I'm like,
and he says the same thing I do about it. If you look at I'm sorry, I know we're running late. If you look in the Bible and do a word search for the little g gods, it shows up 205 times in the Bible. And there's a reference for that. And when you go back to Hebrew and you start looking at that, they're referencing these. If you say Baal or if you say Satan, you're talking about the same. Zeus, what does Christ say? I know where Satan, I know where your seat is. Well, they found that is the throne of Zeus, and it was found in Pergamum. They found it in the same year Hitler was born. They found it. Well, guess what? Hitler ended up taking it to Germany and having a museum made around it in Berlin, and so it's called the throne of Zeus. But guess what? In 2008, the Democratic National Committee, whenever they did their national committee, they copied the throne of Zeus, which is the throne of Satan, for their whole Democratic National Convention.
What?
Yes, and that's you can see it online. It's not something anyway. Getting off. So we're at a point right now, I think, where knowledge is increasing at a point where we can start understanding these things better than we ever could understand it before. But don't take your eyes off of God. God is in charge of all of it.
Here's the thing. Even studying knowledge and good, if it's not what God wants you to do at that time, it's still wrong. The church is so busy doing what they think they want, nobody's listening to see what God wants them to do.
Which is
That's the only thing that counts.
which is exactly what I'm doing in this. We're talking about all these different sects of the Jews. They got off track. They didn't follow God anymore. They were following their laws. The laws became more important to God, and that's what we have to be careful of as you start studying the Bible even deeper. Don't take your eyes off of who you're following and why you're following.
Off the cross, you're finished.
Yep. All right. Anybody else? Okay. Father, thank you again for a wonderful day. I want to pray for all the people that we prayed for earlier, all the sick, people who need help mentally, physically, spiritually, especially spiritually. When our physical body dies, that's not the end for us. But for some people, when their physical body dies, it is the end for them. Help us find a way to defeat Satan in this second war that he's got waged, to take more of us to hell with him than I can't imagine how the world got to where it is, but we are where we are. And I know it's under your plan, and I have no fear because it is your plan. And I hope everyone, that's the main thing, is we're not to live under fear. We are to live under our faith. Faith in Jesus Christ, and the fact that you died on the cross, you went to hell, and you rose again 3 days later. And that was all done so that we don't have to worry about the high priests and all the things that the Jewish people had to worry about. So, forgive us where we fail you. Bless us where you'll bless us. Have mercy on us where we need mercy. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.